Alison. I was preparing my comments for this morning, and I was thinking, I was writing them in a diary which has quotes at the bottom from people, and the quote that was on for today was, "An investment in knowledge always pays the best interest." Just wanted to use this opportunity to say, Alison, just congratulate you for the wonderful job you've done at ODI by convincing people like DFID and AusAid to invest more in producing knowledge on development through ODI. You've really taken it from strength to strength. So let me say about the study that, first of all, I really welcome it. I think it's very timely because this is what is happening on the ground in countries. As you know, or you may know, our organisation has been working on these sorts of issues for a long time, producing guides to what non-traditional donors are doing. And I think it's really timely also because with the new Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, the Paris Declaration is not the only ball game in town, and I'll come back to that at the end, because I think this has some fairly worrying implications for the way that some people are trying to run the Global Partnership or are seeing the Global Partnership going forward. So first of all, I think the really good thing that comes out about the data is the in-country focus. And I really just want to endorse your conclusions, because if I look at South-South cooperation from a global point of view, the work that I'm doing for the UN on the Development Cooperation Forum and their International Development Cooperation Report, which is about to come out shortly, we're talking now at the global level of somewhere around 17 billion at the end of 2011 of South-South cooperation, still rising sharply because, as you know, those economies are still generally booming. And almost all of that is what would be called country programmable aid, so it actually gets to the countries. Because those donors are actually, one might say, slightly more honest than some of the DAC donors in reporting. They don't put refugee spend in, they don't put scholarships in their own countries in, they don't put all sorts of things that we tend to count as ODA. So they're often a lot more honest in the way they report the data. And I think this is what is happening at country level. You do see, I would have said, if I looked at the three countries, Ethiopia's probably shot up a great deal more since then. I think it's about 30% of what's coming into Ethiopia now. Zambia's gone up a bit. But it's fairly typical for most countries that I know of, low-income countries, that you've got around 20%. Of course, there are some countries where it's much more extreme. So places like DRC, Angola, Zimbabwe, virtually Sudan, virtually all the money they're getting is South-South cooperation these days. Why are people wanting that South-South cooperation? And I think it's really good that you have not fallen into the traditional trap of saying this is all about escaping from conditionality as the only reason. The speed, but also cost effectiveness, is really vital. Work that we've just done in the UN, looking at Ethiopia in detail and working out who's winning contracts, is showing that Chinese and Indian subsidiaries or companies operated locally in Ethiopia by Chinese and Indian leaders are actually now winning World Bank, African Development Bank contracts in preference to all the DAC-run companies or the local-run companies. And I think it's very important, as we can move forward, that we realise, particularly with the creation of a BRICS Development Bank, which is probably being announced in the next few days in South Africa, that those people will be winning those contracts and will be posing a very fundamental challenge to our ability as Britain and everybody else's ability to win contracts in multilateral organisations, because they are incredibly cost effective. And that doesn't mean cheap and awful, because if you talk to the aid managers in the countries, the roads last longer, the buildings stay up longer and are easier maintained and so on. So it's not, cheap at any cost. So I think that's the really important issue about South-South cooperation, that it is rising and it is good value, also fast, as you pointed out. Foundations, on the other hand, I also agree that you've really got that right at country level. Why is it that there's this huge gap between what some of the numbers that are bandied around at global level about foundation flows and what you see on the ground? Well, first of all, I was glad to see you took a conservative estimate of global flows, because sometimes people lump in there all the foundation money, even if it's for religious proselytizing or other things that one might not consider to be development. But also, when you get to country level, most of that foundation money, we were talking to Gates Foundation the other day, and they were saying to us, most of our money is still in the north. Most of our money is going to global public goods, research foundations, and NGOs based in the north. Some of it then gets to the south, but their real push at the moment is going south and east to try to get that money more to the ground. And virtually none of it gets anywhere near government. So even if it is getting south and east, it's going to NGOs or other civil society organisations. OSI, for example, have been very innovative in doing that. So that, I think it's quite right that you're finding virtually nothing on the ground. Mm-hmm. The one perhaps exception to that, or it's still not getting to governments, but it is getting a little bit more to the ground, is the growing role of southern foundations, which might be something you want to look at in anything going forward, we're estimating in the UN that they're probably dispersing more than $1 billion a year, and most of that is getting to countries. Notable ones have been there for a long time, like the Aga Khan Foundation, but you've got really big new ones growing up, like Carlos Slim and so on. One other really important reason, I think, why people are diversifying their sources of flows, why developing countries want to get different types of flows. We're about to produce, and we'll be launching at ODI, I think, next month, something called Government Spending Watch, which is a database looking at who's paying for government spending through budgets in all the different sectors, among other things. And what we're finding in that in 2012, for example, is that nearly all the donor flows, traditional donor flows, are going to education, health, water, and to some degree food. And it's the infrastructure that those South-South people are funding. So this sector focus is really, really vital. You can see that, as you pointed out, in roads, but for example with Ethiopian telecoms as well. And so it's also true, to come up with your last finding, that virtually no climate finance, we're seeing no increase in donor flows for climate or environmental finance, which may shock people given the massive focus that there is on these issues in light of Rio +20. But if you look at what's going through poor countries' budgets, it ain't happening. Climate finance, environment finance is pretty much stagnant from a donor point of view. And also for the post-2015 agenda, inequality, finance for inequality, finance for social protection is pretty much stagnant. So I think those non-traditional providers are to some degree cashing in on these gaps and working out that when you talk about alignment, this is what the countries want, this is what the countries need, so they're doing it. On the issue of debt sustainability, again, I'm really glad that you haven't fallen into the sort of global trap of this is all going to ruin countries' debt sustainability. I think that, it's amazing that there have been quite a lot of good studies, first of all by Helmut Reisen at the OECD, pointing out that in general these providers were keeping to the idea that if countries had heavy debt burdens they should give them more concessional money. But nobody seems to listen to that popularly, partly because various world leaders wander around accusing the Chinese of wrecking the debt situation in all of these countries, and that gets more media headlines. What we've found is actually, in many cases, explicitly, there are frameworks within the Chinese Exim Bank, the Indian Exim Bank, which say we will give only concessional money to countries. We will give money which is in line with their national debt strategies. And both the borrowers and the lenders are being pretty responsible about this. Now, that's not always the case. If you're Angola or DRC or Zimbabwe and you don't really care about your debt sustainability, the Chinese will happily give you billions of very expensive money. But that, on the whole, they're sticking to those issues. That's not to say there isn't a debt sustainability issue here. That doesn't come from South-South, but it does come from other types of non-traditional finance. A lot of countries, it'd be interesting to hear Ronald's view on this as well, are turning to private financing initiatives, to domestic debt, and to other sources for funding their infrastructure, because there is such a huge infrastructure gap in most developing countries. And those are very risky sources of funding. The interest rates can go up and down. PFIs, as we know all too well living in London, from the London Tube and Wembley Stadium, can come back on the government's budget very easily. So there are some big risks to debt sustainability, and that would be also something that I think would be worth looking at more in future. Finally, on the issue of how much choice there is, I think there are some countries that are really doing a good job of balancing all these different flows and working out how to allocate them. And as you say, in some cases that involves a sort of divide and rule. We don't want to bring them all in the same room because we don't want them talking to each other. In other countries, it involves bringing them all together because they'd rather have a coordination. But there are also a lot of countries, I must say, that where you get the impression that they're more scrambling for whatever financing source they can get, particularly for their priority infrastructure projects. I think Rwanda would fall into the category, like Ethiopia, where they are pretty clear where they're going to get their money from and they know why. But there are quite a lot of countries out there that aren't that well organized. So I think there are some countries who are really good at dealing with the choice and others that aren't. But equally, it's a very important implication, as you brought out, I think, at the end, for the way the whole global partnership is functioning. We are trying to make, in the next phase of the global partnership, some big efforts to reinforce the whole mutual accountability, local coordination process, government ownership, and so on. And a lot of that is about trying to bring these new providers into those frameworks. The global funds are making a bit more effort to put their money through governments and talk to them. The South-South providers are also doing more of that, and as you say, they're interesting issues in Zambia. There's some other countries where actually some of those southern providers are very fully involved in coordination structures. But I do think it's a very fundamental issue. If we can't get them involved, and if over the next few years DAC aid is going to be stagnant and South-South and foundations are going to carry on rising, then those structures will become less and less representative. And more importantly, I remember some of the stuff that was being discussed at the Cape Conference before, and I think two real implications for that type of analysis. One is that if DAC donors are going to be abandoning middle-income countries, which I hope they're not, because large numbers of poor people are still there, but that might be some of the implication, then these non-traditional providers are going to have pretty much the game to themselves, and you certainly see the Ghanaians and the Zambians getting much more interested in those non-traditional providers as a result. And secondly, that I think some of the advice that's being given to DAC donors to try to compete on the same terms, they haven't got a chance. So if, for example, Britain were to set up its own bilateral development bank, which some people are talking about, or to move a large amount of its money into the infrastructure sector, I honestly think, it would probably be very uncost effective compared to what the Chinese and Indians are doing, and a very bad idea for how to spend Britain's aid money. So I think we need to think very carefully about where this will lead DAC donors, including DFID, to move over the next few years. Because it is a very changing landscape, and one which I welcome, frankly, because I think there are a lot of very high-quality aspects about some of these newer providers, although I remember chairing the session about South-South cooperation in the Cape Conference, and I remember the Chinese professor reminding me that China was not a non-traditional provider. So the only thing I would have said, if you could have found a slightly different word to provide them.
We did try, Matthew.
Well, I honestly, I just think it's better to call it DAC and non-DAC, because there's no real difference in terms of whether they're traditional or not. But that would be my only very small criticism of the report would be that terminology. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Matthew, and I think that's really added a lot more texture to those initial presentations.